My stepson said I'd never be his real dad or truly part of their family, so I walked away without resistance. He got what he asked for. But he'll always remember the hollow quiet when his mother saw I wasn't returning. You know that feeling? The one where you pour your entire heart into building a life, only for the people you call family to slowly, deliberately, start erasing you from it? What if, in their cruel attempt to make you disappear, they unwittingly handed you the perfect weapon for a comeback so utterly devastating, they'd never forget it? I'm Cole. I'm 36, and I learned the hard way that a house can look perfectly lived in, feel warm and inviting, and still be a museum where every single thing screams, "Do not touch." My stepson, Asher, he was 14, and he taught me that lesson with chilling precision. It was a crisp Saturday morning in late October. Leaves crunched underfoot outside, the air smelled like chimney smoke and damp earth. Inside, I was at the kitchen island, whisking pancake batter, humming some old tune my mom used to sing. Asher walked in, eyes like storm glass, grabbed the orange juice, and didn't even bother to look up when I said, "Good morning, champ." He poured, sipped, and then, in the most casual, factual tone, as if commenting on the weather, he said, "You don't need to make me breakfast. You're not my dad." Just like that. A simple sentence. But it felt like someone had reached right into my chest and given my heart a brutal twist. Not enough to break anything, but enough to remind me that bones can ache even without a fracture. I looked at him, hair mussed, hoodie with some band logo I didn't recognize. I tried to channel the unwavering calm I'd promised myself I'd bring into this house when I married his mother, Marin. "I know I'm not," I said, aiming for warm, trying desperately not to sound wounded. "But I'm here, and you're a growing human with exactly one speck of fruit in your bloodstream. Pancakes would help." He just shrugged, kept the juice, and walked out, leaving a deafening trail of silence. The batter in the bowl made a soft popping sound, bubbles breaking, and I felt like I was standing on thin ice, holding my breath, listening for the first crack. Back then, Marin and I were still new enough to pretend our lives had always been arranged this way. My coffee mug next to hers, next to Asher's chipped ceramic dinosaur cup. We'd both bulldozed through our 20s, then spent our early 30s cleaning up the rubble. We wanted safety. I wanted a family that could breathe in the same room. We were so careful with each other, like people carrying a heavy mirror, polite, attentive, trying not to bump the corners. But mirrors, they show you things whether you want them to or not. And the reflection I kept catching was Asher. He'd fortified himself with sarcasm, like an old house wrapped in vines, a quiet, green armor that chokes and climbs all at once. Marin had told me Asher was close with his biological father, but his dad moved 3 states away, turning visits into apologies and apologies into excuses. Something in Asher had hardened. He and Marin became a 2-person team, a language, a weather system all their own. I knew this. I told myself I didn't want to replace anyone, I just wanted to belong. But belonging has a weight, and when you carry it, your hands aren't free for much else. For the first few months, I practically memorized Asher's life like a subway map. Jazz band days, pick-up basketball nights, which teachers were fair, which were apparently out to ruin his life. I showed up. I clapped. I drove. I put my number on every contact form, not to be first, just to be listed. When I fixed the wobbly leg on his desk, I left the screwdriver in the top drawer, just in case he wanted to pretend he'd done it himself. The house itself wore my presence with awkwardness, like a shirt borrowed from a broader-shouldered friend. My tools lined up next to Marin's boxes labeled Asher's old school projects. The seam where our lives joined? It was visible. But I didn't mind. I'd been a contractor, building other people's dreams. I had hoped for something quiet, everyday, like Asher a little taller, Marin laughing at my bad joke, me learning not just where the light switches were, but which one stuck and needed a nudge. The problem with hope, though, is it makes a very quiet sound when it drops. The ground shifted again at a parent-teacher conference. You know the smell of those middle school hallways? Pencil shavings and permanent marker. Marin and I sat side by side, nodding as Asher's social studies teacher, Ms. Hale, droned on. Then she said, "I emailed both of you last week about the missing assignment." Marin turned to me, eyebrows raised. My email was blank. Ms. Hale scrolled, then brightened. "Oh, sorry. I must have sent it to Asher's dad." Nothing wrong with the sentence. It was correct. It just completely skipped over the space I was trying to stand in. Later, in the parking lot, I told Marin it was fine. I wasn't keeping score. I just wanted to be looped in. She squeezed my hand. "Of course, Cole. But when we got home and gently asked Asher to add me to his school portal, he said, "Why would I do that? You're not family. Not cruel, not heated. Just geometry. This belongs here, that belongs there. Rules about how shapes fit. If you tally every small non-invitation, you'll run out of ink." The weekend his grandpa visited and took them to breakfast without asking if I wanted to come. The day the neighbor kid rang the bell and asked if Asher's mom could drive them to practice because the other guy didn't know the shortcuts. The phone calls where Marin's sister called with news, and the speakerphone stayed angled away from me so I could hear but not be heard. I told myself it wasn't personal, even when it felt deeply personal. I told myself families are like rivers, and sometimes you're just a rock the water figures out how to go around. And yet, every time I made a detour for Asher, buying him better sports socks, showing him how to replace a bike chain, coaching him on what to say to the teacher he thought didn't like him, I could see it in his eyes. He accepted the help. He rejected the helper. There's a special kind of quiet that lives in a boy who has already decided to leave first, so he can't be left. It's the quiet that says, I know what these stories do. I know how they end. It didn't help that Marin wanted peace so badly, she sometimes made a shrine of it. She'd build a soft fence around difficult conversations. When I'd ease my hand over the picket, asking softly if she saw what I saw, Asher's crisp refusals, the way he referred to me as he instead of Cole, she'd go still. He's at an age, she'd say, as if adolescence were a storm we'd all agreed to wait out. I don't want to push him. I didn't either. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if nobody drew a map, he'd treat our home like a wilderness where rules don't apply and whoever yells first wins. I promised myself I wouldn't become the stereotype, the man who arrives with new rules just to hear himself obeyed. So, I did what I've always done when a job gets delicate. I slowed down. I listened. I tried to learn the house's language. The squeak on the third stair, the way the back door needed to be lifted. The difference between Asher's okay and his actual okay. I remember one Sunday afternoon in November. The day was so cold it made the sun look dishonest. Asher had a science project due, a model bridge. He'd put it off, and now had that particular teenage frustration, part panic, part certainty that if the world were fair, deadlines would bend to moods. I offered to help him calculate load distribution, something I'd actually done on real projects. He shot me a sideways glance, eyes half open, half shuttered. "I'll just ask Mr. Jenkins tomorrow," he said. When I told him it was due tomorrow, he frowned like he'd been tricked. "Whatever. Mom says I can turn it in a day late." Marin, folding laundry 2 rooms away, called out, "I did not say that." Gentle but firm. I gave Asher the tape measure, watched him flip it out and back. "We can build it together," I said, still trying to tuck the offer in a way that made it easy to accept. He put the tape measure down like he'd set aside an argument, not a tool. "I don't need you," he said. Again, not cruel, not heated. Just a boy writing the correct label on a box. "You're not my dad." It would be convenient to say that was the moment something changed, but it wasn't a thunderclap. People like to tell stories about big breaks. Real life does its damage in drafts. Later that week, I picked him up from practice because Marin worked late. He got in the truck, hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets, and immediately changed the radio to some static Y station that sounded like 2 robots arguing in a cave. Halfway home, he cleared his throat and asked, in a tone that tried and failed to be casual, if I could drop him off 2 blocks from the house because Zach's brother might be outside, and he talks a lot. I pulled over 2 blocks early. He opened the door, hesitated, and said, "It's just easier." I wanted to scream, "Easier for whom? Do you realize I'd memorized which shoes you kick under the bench by the front door? That I knew the way your voice loosens when you talk about music? That I'd learned your joke timing and left space for the laugh you give when you surprise yourself?" I said none of that. I just said, "Got it." And he shut the door so gently it felt like a thank you only I could hear. 2 days later, I overheard him on a voice chat, telling someone, "No, that wasn't my dad. That was my mom's husband." Then, with a chilling casualness, "No, not my dad. I don't have one." Let me be clear. I never wanted to fight a teenager for territory in his own life. If anything, I wanted to build more of it. Add a wing where he could put his hobbies, a quiet loft where he could climb when everything felt loud. But territory has rules whether you write them down or not. And the rule we kept bumping into said that if I stepped toward Asher, someone would whisper that I was stepping over him. Marin's ex started texting more around then. Pictures of a dog he'd adopted, a video of snow in his new city, a promise to visit soon. Each time Marin's phone pinged, it felt like a test I hadn't studied for. She tried to be transparent, holding the phone where I could see, rolling her eyes when the promises grew grand and improbable. "He's still not great at follow-through," she'd say, and I would nod like a man agreeing that rain was, in fact, wet. But inside, I could feel a gear clicking forward. Asher's dad floating back into orbit, a bright object he could point to and say, "There. That is where belonging lives. Don't confuse me by offering a different address." When the holidays arrived, the house got merry with effort. I wrestled the tree into the stand, letting Asher hang the good ornaments while I filled in the backs with the ones nobody liked. Maren played her old favorites. For a few hours, peace felt possible, something you could set out on a platter and slice for everyone. Then, as we were packing up the ornament boxes, Asher asked if we could skip the weird morning thing on Christmas. Our tradition from scratch, cinnamon rolls, coffee, taking turns reading notes from stockings. "It just feels forced," he said, and I could tell by the way he didn't look at me that forced meant me. Maren, caught between us with the tinsel, tried to negotiate. We could make it shorter. We could move it to afternoon. Asher shrugged. "I just don't want to pretend we're something we're not." He left it there, and I stood in the living room, hand on a cardboard box, staring at our reflection in the dark window. A man, a woman, a boy. 3 shapes that should have made a family in the glass. The glass didn't lie. It just didn't offer captions. What slid the knife in deeper was how courteous Asher could be to me in public. At the grocery store, he'd step aside so I could push the cart. At the rec center, he'd say, "Thanks for the ride," loud enough for his friends to hear. I understood politeness could be a mask, sometimes a gift. Still, in those moments, I felt like a substitute teacher with a good classroom voice, respected at arm's length, trusted to keep the pencils sharpened. One night after a game, the boys crowded around, slapping each other on the shoulders. "Your dad's truck is nice," one of them told Asher. He didn't even blink. "That's not my dad," he said. I'd heard it before, but this time, the boy looked at me, saw me seeing me, and fumbled. "Oh, sorry, man." I smiled and pretended to be amused. When Asher climbed in, I said carefully, "You don't have to correct kids like that. It just gets awkward." He didn't look up from his phone. "It would be awkward to lie," he said. The screen lit his face from below, making him look like someone I was still getting to know. Then came the evening that would turn from hint to pattern, from pattern to undeniable problem. A Wednesday full of that frayed energy midweek brings. Maren was at a late meeting. I made spaghetti because it felt like the most neutral food on earth. Something you could offer without implying a philosophy. I set 2 plates on the table and texted Asher. 5 minutes. 10. 15. When I knocked on his bedroom door, I heard laughter burst and cut off. "Can we talk for a second?" I asked through the door. It opened slowly. He was on a video call with 2 friends, his phone propped against a water bottle. Everyone's faces were little moons in a rectangle sky. "I made dinner," I said. "You can eat later," he said, not unkindly, like we were discussing the weather again. "It'll be cold," I said. "Microwave exists." One of the little moons chirped, and they all laughed. Not cruel, but definitely not with me. I felt something wobble inside, the way a table does when you discover one leg is shorter than you thought. "I'd like us to eat together," I said. He tightened his jaw, glanced at the screen, and then said distinctly, "My mom said I could eat in my room." I didn't know whether that was true. Maybe she had once. Maybe he was generalizing permission. Maybe he was testing boundaries, the way you tap a fence to hear if the chain link rattles. I stepped back, tried again. "It matters to me that we sit down sometimes. It's not about control. It's about being in the same room." He held my gaze long enough to let me know this wasn't a misunderstanding. Then he delivered the line that would echo later in the quietest corners of my head. "Why do you care so much? You're not my dad." The friends on the screen went quiet. Their faces tilted, curious. I swallowed. For a heartbeat, rage wasn't even in the catalog. Only the old ache of someone watching a door slide shut. "I care because I live here," I said, more softly than I felt. "I care because I care about your mother. I care because I like you." He nodded like a judge handing down a sentence. "You don't have to," he said. Then he picked up his phone and put his headphones on, which is the modern version of turning your back. I ate at the table alone, the spaghetti going gummy as it cooled. The house hummed, fridge cycling on, heater exhaling, pipes clinking as someone used water upstairs. I tried to picture my way out of the moment. Tomorrow, I would apologize for knocking at the wrong time. Tomorrow, I would tell him the story of how my own stepfather won me with quiet persistence and the correct wrench size. Tomorrow, I would draw a line that wasn't a threat, just a shape for us to fill in. But tomorrow sits on a shelf above tonight, and you can't reach it when your arms are full of the present. When Maren got home, I told her what happened. She put her hands on my shoulders and asked if I was okay, in a voice that said she knew the question was insufficient. I said I was, because the truth would require a longer conversation than either of us had energy for. She went upstairs to say goodnight to Asher. I sat there long enough for the streetlights to switch off. That was the first time I caught myself wondering whether I was building a house where I would never be allowed to live. It wasn't a decision. Not then. It was a thought I pretended was a stranger that had wandered in and would wander out again. The next morning, the house smelled like toast and shampoo. Asher came downstairs, backpack half-zipped. Maren, hair up, keys in her mouth. Ride? I asked, holding up my keys. We're good, Asher said, and he and Maren traded a look I couldn't read. On the way out, he paused, looked at me like he was measuring something. Distance, maybe, and said, not mean, not sharp, only perfectly precise. You don't have to try so hard. The door closed. The house sighed. The quiet that followed felt different than other quiets. And I sat in it, listening to what it had to say. The weeks that followed felt like watching a slow leak in a ceiling. Not a sudden flood, but a steady drip you can't quite patch without tearing half the house apart. Maren kept trying to be the diplomat, smoothing over sharp edges before they could scrape anyone too deep. But diplomacy, when applied too often, starts to look like favoritism to the person who is always asked to give ground. And in this case, that was me. It showed up in the little negotiations that never seemed to go both ways. If Asher wanted to skip dinner, Maren would sigh and let him. If I asked if we could all sit together once or twice a week, the request was labeled pressure. When Asher wanted the newer phone upgrade before his contract was up, Maren said, we'll make it work just this once. When I suggested we wait, she smiled at me like I was the one being unreasonable. The message was clear. My job was to adapt. His job was to be accommodated. I told myself this was temporary, that teens test boundaries. But there was something sharper underneath. It wasn't just boundary testing. It was Asher learning that if he framed me as not real family, he could tilt every scale in his favor. Thanksgiving was the first time the favoritism felt like a performance. Maren's parents came over. The table creaked with turkey and sides, and everyone traded polite laughter while I carved. Asher, phone under the table, barely engaged until his grandfather asked him how school was going. Suddenly, he was animated, telling stories, even making jokes. When Maren's dad glanced at me and said, sounds like you're doing a good job, Cole, I smiled. But before I could thank him, Asher cut in smoothly, that's Mom. She's the one who does everything. The room chuckled. Maren's cheeks flushed, and she reached across to squeeze Asher's hand like he'd just delivered a toast. I sat there with the carving knife still in my hand, realizing I had just been edited out of my own home in front of an audience. December only deepened the rift. Maren had promised we'd plan the holiday together, but every decision seemed to land without me. Asher didn't want me in their matching pajamas photo. He said it would look weird to his friends on Instagram. Maren laughed it off, told me not to take it personally, then posed with him on the couch, their flannel pants matching, while I held the camera. Later, when I suggested we could do a separate photo, she said gently, maybe next year, when things feel easier. The word next was meant to soothe, but it echoed like a permanent postponement of belonging. The manipulation became clearer in January when Asher started using me as leverage. If he wanted something, he'd angle it through me, knowing Maren would take his side if I pushed back. One evening, he asked if he could stay overnight at a friend's house. I said fine, but reminded him about his unfinished assignments. He rolled his eyes, muttered, "You're not my real dad," and stomped upstairs. 10 minutes later, Maren came down with her phone. "Asher feels like you're being too strict," she said softly. "Maybe just let him go this time." When I asked her if she realized he was triangulating us, she frowned and said, "He's just a kid. Don't make it bigger than it is." But I could see it. He had figured out the formula. Push against me, watch her bend. The pattern grew sharper with every week. Asher's requests grew bolder, Maren's defenses of him more reflexive, and my presence more optional. He started making plans without telling me, knowing his mom would back him. He would sit at the dinner table, tell a story, and leave me out of it entirely, as if narrating a version of his life where I didn't exist. And every time I tried to gently insert myself, to remind him I was here, invested, present, he would find a way to turn it into overstepping. I began to wonder if he wasn't just resisting me, but actively working to erase me. The worst came one Saturday afternoon when Marin was at work and I drove Asher to basketball practice. He'd left his shoes in the back, and as he laced them up in the gym parking lot, he muttered into his phone, "Yeah, my mom's husband drove me." "No, not my dad. I don't have one." He said it casually, but with a precision that made it sting deeper than any outburst could have. I froze, gripping the steering wheel, realizing that for him, I wasn't even a failed father figure. I was simply nothing. That silence, the one he'd left hanging in the car, followed me home. And it was in that silence that I began to wonder if I was invisible in my own family. What was I even holding on to? It was a Thursday evening when the crack in the floorboards finally widened enough to swallow me whole. Marin was working late again, and I'd just gotten home from a job site, dust still clinging to my jeans. The house smelled faintly of garlic and tomato sauce. Asher had heated up leftovers. I dropped my tool bag by the door, called out a hello, and got only the muffled thud of footsteps upstairs in return. I told myself it was fine, normal, just a teenager retreating into his world. But when I went into the kitchen to grab a drink, I noticed something odd. The recycling bin was full of takeout containers, pizza boxes, burger wrappers, 2 milkshake cups with straws still sticky around the rim. All from restaurants Asher liked, none of which I had been invited to. I stood there, trying to piece it together. Marin hadn't mentioned going out. She'd been in meetings until late, which meant Asher had been out with someone else. I checked my phone out of habit, wondering if I had missed a text. Nothing. But the thought stuck. Who had taken him? And then the front door clicked open. Marin walked in, holding a paper bag from the very same burger place I'd just seen evidence of. She looked tired but cheerful, kissed me on the cheek, and set the bag on the counter. "Grabbed you something," she said, pulling out a single wrapped sandwich. My stomach tightened. "You already ate?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. She hesitated. "Yeah, we got hungry. Figured I'd bring you one back." "We." Not I. "We." I pressed. "You and Asher went out without telling me." She froze mid-unwrapping, eyes flicking up to mine. "It wasn't a big deal, Cole. He wanted to celebrate finishing his project." You didn't think I'd want to be there," I finished for her. The air in the kitchen felt heavier than it should have. Marin's expression shifted from guilty to defensive. "It wasn't about you. He just wanted time with me alone." The words stung more than I expected. Not because I thought I needed every dinner, but because the choice had been made behind my back, like family moments were currency, and I wasn't invited to the exchange. I sat at the table, the untouched sandwich in front of me, and tried to swallow the knot forming in my throat. Before I could find the right words, Asher came downstairs, earbuds still dangling from his ears. He glanced at me, then at the bag on the counter, and smirked. "Oh, you got him one?" he asked Marin. She nodded. He shrugged. "That's nice." The way he said it wasn't gratitude. It was dismissal. As if I were some neighbor who had been tossed leftovers out of courtesy. I felt something shift inside me. An awareness that this wasn't just about being excluded. It was about being deliberately pushed to the margins. The real betrayal, though, came a week later. It was a Sunday, gray and damp. The kind of day that made the walls of the house feel closer. I went to grab my laptop from the den, and when I sat down at the desk, the screen lit up with a browser window that hadn't been closed. It was Asher's school portal. He must have used my laptop without logging out. I wasn't looking for anything, but my eyes caught on the recent messages tab. And there it was, a thread between Asher and Marin. Asterisk, don't tell Cole. Okay, he'll make it weird. Asterisk, Asher had written. The message was about their dinner, but it didn't stop there. Scrolling further, I saw other instances. Asterisk, let's just do it ourselves. Asterisk, asterisk, he doesn't need to come. Asterisk, asterisk, can it just be you and me this time? Asterisk, and the worst part, Marin agreeing. Not always eagerly, but consistently. Asterisk, sure, just us. Asterisk, asterisk, don't worry, I won't say anything. Asterisk, it was like being erased in real time. My wife, the person I thought was my partner, was colluding, even if she thought it was harmless. I sat there staring at the screen until my hands started to shake. It wasn't just a teenager's rebellion anymore. It was sanctioned. Encouraged. That night, when I tried to talk to Marin, her first response wasn't an apology. It was an explanation. Cole, you don't understand. He needs me. He doesn't trust easily. If forcing you into every moment makes him resentful, what good does that do? Her words felt like a verdict. Not about my worth, but about my place. I wasn't to be part of the inner circle. I was to wait at the edges, patient, grateful for scraps, while the real family carried on without me. And in that moment, with her defending secrecy and him smirking in the background, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't fighting for inclusion anymore. I was fighting against deliberate exclusion. They weren't just leaving me out. They were closing the door and locking it behind them. That was the night I stopped wondering whether I was being paranoid. The betrayal wasn't subtle anymore. It was undeniable, and it set the stage for a decision I could feel building in me, like a storm waiting for the right crack of thunder to finally break. The weeks after that discovery felt like walking through a house that wasn't mine, even though my name was on the mortgage. Every creak of the floorboards, every photograph on the mantel, every coffee mug in the cabinet reminded me that I was living in someone else's story. The betrayal had lodged itself in me like a splinter, impossible to ignore. And yet, I said nothing. I couldn't, not without turning the fragile peace into open war. So instead, I shrank. I pulled back. And in the pulling back, I began to see just how invisible I had already become. Dinner became the first casualty. I stopped insisting on us eating together, and soon enough, Marin and Asher started making plans without even mentioning it. Some nights I'd come home to find them on the couch with takeout containers between them, watching a show they both liked. Their laughter bubbling through the living room. My footsteps in the doorway felt like an intrusion. Marin would look up, startled, and say, "Oh, you're home. Want some?" Always after the fact. Always an afterthought. I'd smile, shake my head, and retreat to the kitchen where the fridge light became my dinner companion. The second casualty was the little traditions I tried to build. Sunday mornings, I used to make pancakes, ritual born from my childhood, something I thought could be ours. After that night in October, when Asher dismissed me over orange juice, I tried to keep it alive anyway, but by December, neither of them came down for breakfast. The last Sunday I bothered, I sat at the table alone with a plate stacked high, the butter melting into golden circles, and listened to muffled laughter drifting from upstairs. The pancakes grew cold, then hard, and eventually so did something in me. It wasn't just about meals, though. It was the silence. Marin and Asher had their own rhythm, their own inside jokes, their own shorthand glances. And when I tried to join, the beat always skipped. One night, I walked into the living room to find them scrolling through old photos on Marin's laptop. Vacations, birthdays, moments from before me. They looked so absorbed, so content that I lingered in the doorway for a full minute before Marin noticed. She closed the laptop gently, as if tucking away a secret, and said, "We were just looking at old times." The message was clear. This was their past, their bond, and I had no place in it. I began spending more time at work, volunteering for longer hours, taking on extra projects. It was easier to lose myself in drywall and blueprints than to sit in a house that hummed with life but left me out of its current. Colleagues started joking that I was married to the job. And I laughed along, because in a way, they were right. At least there, I knew my value. At least there, my presence mattered. At home, my value was eroding quietly. Asher no longer looked at me when he spoke, if he spoke at all. Marin, caught between us, chose the path of least resistance every time, which meant choosing him. I stopped trying to correct it. I stopped asking to be included. Instead, I became a ghost in my own house. Present but silent, moving around them without disturbing the air. But ghosts see things. And what I saw more and more clearly was the truth. I had already been written out. My suffering wasn't loud. It was quiet, the kind of ache that comes from absence rather than blows. But in that silence, a thought began to take shape. Fragile at first, then sharper with every passing day. If I couldn't belong here, then maybe I shouldn't stay here. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't even admit it fully to myself. But I started moving differently. Leaving tools at the job site instead of bringing them home. Letting the laundry pile up in my corner of the closet, as if I wouldn't be needing it for long. Checking my savings account more often, calculating silently how far it would carry me if I walked away. At night, lying beside Marin, I listened to her breathing and wondered if she noticed the space growing between us. Some nights, I caught her hand twitch toward her phone on the nightstand, as if she was waiting for a text, even in her sleep. I never asked who she hoped it might be. Rock bottom wasn't one single moment. It was the accumulation of all the small ones, the untouched dinners, the unshared jokes, the invitations that never reached me. It was realizing that the house was warm, but I was cold. That the laughter was real, but not for me. And in that quiet, where the suffering settled heavy on my chest, I began to plan. Not out of spite, not even out of anger, but out of the desperate clarity that sometimes the only way to be seen is to disappear. When I finally started pulling away, it wasn't with slammed doors or shouted words. It was quiet, deliberate, like easing a boat from a dock in the middle of the night. I'd already learned silence was my only weapon in that house. But now I began wielding it differently. Not as surrender, but as a boundary. Instead of waiting for an invitation, I built a life outside those walls. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt myself breathing without asking permission. It started at work. I've been a contractor most of my life, but I'd always stayed in the safe lane, steady projects, enough to pay the bills, never enough to change the game. With more time on my hands and less energy wasted trying to wedge myself into a family that wouldn't hold me, I said yes to bigger jobs. I took a renovation project downtown that other contractors had turned down because of its scope, a crumbling old warehouse meant to be turned into loft apartments. It was a mess, mold, outdated wiring, structural issues. But I threw myself into it. My crew noticed. My clients noticed. And soon, so did people I hadn't even met. Word of mouth is currency in my line of work, and my name started circulating in rooms I'd never been invited into before. An architect I respected reached out about partnering on future builds. A property developer asked me to bid on projects I wouldn't have dared to touch a year earlier. For the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. Not because anyone handed me respect, but because I had earned it on my own terms. Every blueprint signed, every beam raised was a reminder that I had worth, even if my own family refused to see it. The money followed. Not in a flashy way at first, but in steady, undeniable increments. The kind of money that changes possibilities. I upgraded my truck, not to show off, but because I needed something that could handle the workload. I invested in better tools for my crew, and their loyalty deepened in return. One of them, a younger guy named Mateo, told me one day, "Boss, you've got a reputation now. People know you finish strong." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Maybe because it was exactly the kind of acknowledgement I never got at home. Outside of work, I began filling my evenings differently. Instead of sitting in the kitchen listening to muffled laughter upstairs, I started going to the gym again. I reconnected with an old friend from college, David, who had just moved back to town. We met up for coffee, then dinner, and before long, we were laughing like we hadn't lost a decade. He asked me how things were at home, and though I didn't spill everything, I admitted I felt displaced. He didn't pity me. He just listened, then said, "Maybe it's time you stopped waiting for a seat at a table that isn't set for you." That line became a kind of mantra. I stopped waiting. I started traveling on weekends when I didn't have projects. Small trips at first, driving upstate to hike trails I hadn't seen in years, renting a cabin for a night just to sit by a fire without hearing the constant low hum of rejection in the background. Every time I came back, the house felt a little less like a cage. I could feel myself loosening, as if some invisible rope had been tugging at my chest for too long, and I was finally letting it unwind. Mara noticed. Of course. She'd ask where I'd been, why I didn't wait for them before making plans. I'd answer calmly, no edge in my voice. "I figured you had your own thing going." She'd frown like she couldn't quite place the new rhythm. Asher, for his part, barely looked up. If anything, my absence seemed to confirm what he'd been trying to prove all along, that I didn't belong. But what he didn't see was how that very absence was giving me strength. Because while they tightened their circle, I expanded mine. Clients respected me. Friends valued me. Strangers paid me for my skill and left me with gratitude. Each day, I carried a little less of their rejection and a little more of my own worth. My name, my work, my presence. They were being recognized in ways that no teenager's cutting remark could erase. And deep down, though I never said it aloud, I began to see the power in my silence. They thought I was fading, irrelevant. But what they didn't realize was that I was building. I was laying foundations elsewhere, stronger ones that didn't crumble under the weight of dismissal. It was in that quiet growth, financial, personal, emotional, that the first seeds of a different kind of plan began to take root. Not just leaving, not just escaping, but leaving in a way that they would feel the absence, taste it, choke on it. A silence so heavy it would force them to hear what they had been refusing to listen to all along. The turning point didn't arrive with fireworks or confrontation. It came the way most life-altering moments do, quietly slipping into place while no one else was paying attention. By the time I realized what I had in my hands, the setup for revenge had already begun. It started with a warehouse project. The developer, a sharp but fair guy named Lyle, asked me to stay on after completion as his go-to contractor for future builds. He didn't just want my labor, he wanted my judgment. He'd seen. How I solved problems under pressure, how I turned chaos into something livable, and he trusted me. For a man who'd been treated like an afterthought in his own house, that trust was a kind of oxygen. Soon, I was sitting in meetings I never thought I'd be invited to, rooms with architects, investors, and city planners. At first, I sat quietly, learning the rhythm. But little by little, I realized my voice carried weight. When I made a suggestion, people took notes. When I laid out a plan, they followed it. I wasn't just a contractor anymore. I was becoming a partner. The money shifted again, more quickly this time. With each project, I carved out a bigger stake. My accounts grew in a way that almost embarrassed me. I didn't talk about it at home. Marin never asked. And Asher certainly didn't care. But I knew. I knew I was building something far bigger than a paycheck. Power, influence, independence. All the things that couldn't be taken from me by a teenager's sneer or a spouse's silence. But what made it interesting, what turned it from personal growth into potential revenge, was how much of my life outside the house remained invisible to them. Marin and Asher still treated me like the quiet extra in their family story, assuming I was fading into irrelevance. They had no idea that while they closed ranks, I was building an empire under their noses. The contrast was almost surreal. In one world, I was dismissed, ignored, erased. In the other, I was respected, valued, and even sought after. And the two worlds were on a collision course. The setup deepened in unexpected ways. David, my old college friend, turned out to have contacts in finance. Over a long dinner one night, I told him about the contracts I was signing and the money flowing in. He leaned back in his chair, whistled low, and said, "Cole, you don't realize it yet, but you're sitting on a foundation most people would kill for. You don't need anyone's permission anymore. You can choose who gets to stand beside you." His words hit me like a hammer. For so long, I had been trying to win permission to belong in a family that didn't want me. But out here, in the world I was building, I didn't need permission. I only needed clarity. And clarity came one evening when I returned home earlier than usual. Marin and Asher were in the living room, laughing over something on his phone. I set down my keys quietly, and before they noticed me, I heard him say, "See, I told you he doesn't matter. He's barely even around anymore." Marin didn't correct him. She didn't defend me. She just sighed, a soft sound, almost indulgent, and said, "Let's not talk about it right now." That silence. Her silence. It spoke louder than words. They thought my absence was weakness. They thought I was shrinking. What they didn't know is that I was preparing. That night, I lay awake, the decision forming in me with sharp edges. I wasn't going to explode, to scream, to demand they see me. That would only prove their point. No, I would let them have exactly what they said they wanted. A house without me. A life where I didn't matter. And I would leave it in such a way that they would feel every square inch of the silence I left behind. Because here's the truth I had finally learned. Sometimes revenge isn't about words or confrontation. Sometimes it's about stepping out so completely, so suddenly, that the echo of your absence fills the room louder than your presence ever could. And thanks to the power I'd built outside those walls, I finally had the means to do it. Not just walk away, but walk away clean, strong, untouchable. All I needed was the right moment. And I could feel it coming, like a storm pressing down on the horizon, waiting for the first crack of thunder. The moment came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday in late spring, one of those deceptively warm days where the air hums with the promise of summer. Marin had suggested a family dinner, a phrase that by then felt hollow, though I went along anyway. She made reservations at a nice place downtown, one I knew Asher liked because his friends hung out there after games. I wore a collared shirt, washed the dust from my hands, and told myself this was just another performance. What I didn't tell them was that I had already made my decision, and that night was going to be my stage. We sat down at a corner booth, menus open, and for the first 10 minutes, everything was polite. Marin asked Asher about school. He gave short answers, more interested in scrolling through his phone. When the waiter came, Marin ordered for both of them without even glancing at me, like it was second nature. I placed my order separately, quietly. The food came. Conversation drifted. And just as the plates were cleared, Asher leaned back, crossed his arms, and delivered the line that would seal it. "You don't have to keep coming to these things," he said. Not cruelly, not even angrily. Just factually, the way someone points out that the sky is blue. It's not like you're really family. Mom and I can do it ourselves. Marin didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She just gave me that tired look she'd given 100 times before, the one that begged me not to make a scene. And in that silence, hers, his, the restaurant's hum all around us, I knew it was time. I reached into my jacket pocket and set 2 envelopes on the table. One with Marin's name on it. One with Asher's. "You're right," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I don't have to keep coming. And after tonight, I won't." They both stared, confused. Marin reached for her envelope, opened it, and froze. Inside was a check large enough to cover the remaining mortgage payments on the house, paid in full. Beside it, a typed letter, my formal notice that I was walking away, signed and dated. Asher opened his envelope next. Inside was nothing but silence on paper. A blank page folded neatly with a single line at the bottom in my handwriting. Asterisk, "You got exactly what you wanted." Asterisk, the color drained from his face, though he tried to mask it with a smirk. Marin, meanwhile, looked up at me, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. For once, their silence was heavier than mine. I stood, slid my chair back carefully so it didn't scrape, and said, "Enjoy your dinner." Then I left. No shouting. No dramatics. Just absence. When I stepped outside into the warm night air, I didn't feel relief right away. What I felt was weight, the kind that comes after carrying something for too long. But beneath it, there was something sharper. Power. Because for years, I had been invisible in that house. And now, in walking away, I had made myself unforgettable. The revenge wasn't in the check or the letter. It was in the silence that would follow me out the door. The silence that would settle into their house like a ghost. Every dinner without me. Every holiday missing my chair. Every laugh interrupted by the question neither of them would say aloud, "What have we done?" And I knew deep down that silence would be louder than anything I could have shouted. The fallout didn't erupt in a single explosion. It spread like cracks through glass, slow and unstoppable. By the time Marin realized I was truly gone, it was already too late. I moved out the following week, quietly, efficiently. My things were packed in boxes before she could muster an argument. My name scrubbed from the bills. My presence erased from the routines of their home. Except, of course, it wasn't erased at all. It lingered. I could feel it in the way Marin's voice trembled when she called me a month later, asking why the house felt so unbearably quiet. At first, she tried to cover it with casual words. "It's strange not having you here," she said over the phone, her tone too light, like she was auditioning for indifference. But by the end of the call, her voice cracked. "I didn't think you meant it. I thought you were just angry." I didn't respond with anger or forgiveness. I simply said, "I told you I wouldn't fight." And then I ended the call. The silence after that was her answer. For Asher, the consequences came slower but sharper. Without me in the picture, his world shrank. Marin had always stretched herself thin, trying to be both parents. But with no one to share the load, the cracks in her patience began to show. She couldn't drive him to every practice, attend every event, or smooth over every rough edge. His biological father made a few promises, but as always, they dissolved before they materialized. And Asher, who once smirked and said I wasn't his real dad, started to feel the emptiness where my presence had been. One evening, months later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Asher had been dropped off late to a game. He'd walked into the gym alone, no one in the bleachers for him. Someone asked if his parents were coming. He'd shrugged and said, "It's just me tonight." I imagined the echo of his own words, the ones he had thrown at me so casually, "You're not my dad." I wondered if he realized now what he had really asked for. As for me, my life only widened. The projects flourished. My reputation grew. And the independence I had built became not just survival, but triumph. The silence that once suffocated me became fuel. I spent weekends traveling, investing, living without apology. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt unshakable. The last time I saw them was almost a year after I left. I was downtown, walking into a restaurant to meet David. Through the glass, I spotted Marin and Asher at a table near the window. They weren't laughing. They weren't animated. They were eating in silence, both staring at their plates. For a moment, neither of them noticed me. And in that moment, I saw it. The consequence they could never outrun. They had gotten exactly what they wanted. A family without me, and it looked nothing like what they thought it would. Asher glanced up, saw me through the glass, and froze. His fork paused midair, eyes wide, his face pale in the reflection. Marin followed his gaze, her hand tightening around her glass until her knuckles whitened. I met their eyes for a single unbroken second. Then I turned and walked inside, not toward them, but past them, into a different life entirely. And as I sat down at my own table, laughter already bubbling from the friends waiting for me, I realized the final truth. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't in what you say or do. It's in what you leave behind. The silence they mocked had become my weapon. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to walk away from something you poured your heart into to finally find your own worth? Tell me what you think. I really want to know.